In the glittering heart of Constantinople, where golden domes pierce the sky and imperial purple flows like rivers of power, the most scandalous transformation in history was about to unfold. This is the story of a woman who rose from the lowest depths of society to the highest throne in Christendom, and the shocking practices that defined her reign. Her name was Theodora. History remembers her as an empress, a saint, a reformer. But before she wore the crown, she was something else entirely. Something that would make even the most jaded Byzantine courtiers whisper in horror behind their silk fans. This isn't just the story of one woman's rise to power. This is the story of how the most Christian empire on earth became home to practices so disturbing, so twisted, that they challenged the very foundations of morality itself. Picture Constantinople in the year 500 AD. The Roman Empire may have fallen in the west, but here in the east, the Byzantine Empire blazes with wealth and power. The hippodrome, that massive arena where 100,000 spectators gather to watch chariot races, is the beating heart of the city. But the races are just the beginning, because after the chariots have thundered past, after the crowds have chosen their winners, the real entertainment begins. The kind of entertainment that would make a Roman blush. Enter the actresses, not the respectable performers of legitimate theater, but women who specialized in a very different kind of performance. Women who stripped away not just their clothing, but every shred of dignity, every trace of shame, to satisfy the twisted appetites of an empire that claimed to follow Christ. Theodora was one of these women, the daughter of a bearkeeper at the hippodrome, born into poverty so grinding that survival meant doing things that decent people couldn't even imagine. What exactly did Theodora do on that stage? The historical sources are both explicit and horrifying. The Byzantine historian Procopius, writing in his Secret History, describes performances that combined theater with acts so depraved that they tested the limits of human degradation. Theodora didn't just act in these performances. She innovated them. She created spectacles that drew crowds not for their artistry, but for their sheer audacity. Performances that involved multiple partners, animal costumes, and acts of humiliation that would be considered extreme even by today's standards. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. This wasn't happening in some barbarian kingdom, pagan temple. This was happening in the heart of the Christian world, in an empire that proclaimed itself the defender of orthodox faith and moral virtue. How did a Christian society justify watching such spectacles? How did they reconcile their faith, their appetites? The answer reveals something dark about human nature, about how power corrupts not just individuals, but entire civilizations. By her early 20s, Theodora had become the most famous or infamous performer in Constantinople. Men would travel from across the empire just to see her act. Senators would bid fortunes for private performances. The emperor's own nephew, Justinian, became obsessed with her. But Theodora was planning something that no one saw coming. She was planning to transform herself from the lowest woman in society to the highest, from an object of desire to the wielder of absolute power. The first step was leaving the stage. Theodora abandoned her career at its peak, when she could have continued earning enormous sums from her performances. Instead, she did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She claimed to have found religion. Was this conversion genuine, or was it the most brilliant political calculation in Byzantine history? The evidence suggests it might have been both. Because Theodora didn't just adopt Christianity, she weaponized it, turning moral reform into a tool for gaining power over the very people who had once paid to watch her degrade herself. Justinian was supposed to be untouchable, the nephew and heir of Emperor Justin I. He was destined to rule the most powerful empire on earth. He was educated, religious, politically astute, everything a future emperor should be. But he had one weakness: an obsession with a former actress whose reputation was so scandalous that Roman law actually forbade him from marrying her. How did Theodora manage to seduce not just a man, but an entire empire? The answer lies in understanding something crucial about power in Byzantium. It wasn't just about armies and gold. It was about spectacle, about creating an image so compelling that reality bent around it. The Theodora had spent years studying what men wanted, what they feared, what they desired most desperately. She had learned to read power like a script, to manipulate desire like a stage manager directing a play. Now she was ready to give the performance of her lifetime. The law was clear. Senators could not marry actresses. The reasoning was simple. Actresses were considered little better than prostitutes, their profession inherently immoral, their very existence a threat to the social order. But Justinian was willing to break any law to have Theodora. He began a campaign to change the legislation that stood between them, using his influence with his uncle the emperor to rewrite the moral foundation of the empire itself. Think about what this means. The future ruler of the Byzantine Empire was so obsessed with the former performer that he was willing to overturn centuries of legal precedent. He was willing to defy the Senate, the church, and public opinion to make her his wife. The opposition was fierce. Senators who had once paid to watch Theodora perform now fought desperately to prevent her from becoming their empress. Church leaders who preached about moral purity found themselves caught between their principles and their political survival. In 525 AD, Justinian and Theodora were married in a ceremony that shocked the known world. The former actress, who had once performed acts of public degradation, now wore imperial purple and received the homage of the most powerful nobles in Christendom. But the wedding was just the beginning, because when Justinian became emperor in 527 AD, Theodora didn't just become his consort, she became his co-ruler, wielding power that no Byzantine empress had ever possessed. And with that power came the opportunity to reshape the empire according to her own twisted vision of morality and justice. Theodora began implementing policies that revealed just how deeply her past had shaped her worldview. The fighting war had ceased terrible. She legalized practices that had been forbidden, criminalized behaviors that had been accepted, and created a court culture that blended Christian piety with indulgences that would have made pagan Romans blush. What went on behind the closed doors of Theodora's private apartments? The historical sources hint at practices that combined elements of her theatrical past with the unlimited power of imperial rule. Theodora reportedly maintained a network of young women who served not just as servants, but as participants in private entertainments that recreated and expanded on her former stage performances. These weren't just parties, they were elaborate rituals that blended pleasure with power, sex with statecraft. Visitors to the imperial palace reported seeing things that challenged their understanding of Christian morality. Senators who came expecting to discuss policy found themselves witnessing spectacles that belonged more in a brothel than a throne room. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how Zephyra used these practices as tools of political control, rewarding allies with access to her inner circle, while punishing enemies with exclusion from the very debauchery they publicly condemned. Here's where Theodora's story becomes truly fascinating and truly horrifying. Because while she was privately indulging in practices that would shock modern sensibilities, she was simultaneously positioning herself as a champion of Christian moral reform. She funded churches, supported monasteries, and championed legislation that protected women from sexual exploitation. She outlawed forced prostitution, created shelters for former sex workers, and used imperial power to prosecute those who trafficked in human misery. Was this hypocrisy or something more complex? The evidence suggests that Theodora genuinely believed she was serving both God and her own desires, that her past gave her unique insight into human weakness, and her power gave her the ability to reshape society according to her own understanding of justice. But this created an empire of contradictions, where the same woman who preached sexual purity in public was privately orchestrating elaborate entertainments that pushed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Theodora created something unprecedented in Byzantine history, a network of informants and agents whose job was to monitor and control the sexual behavior of the imperial court. These weren't just spies, they were enforcers of a moral code that existed only in the empress's mind. Courtiers found their private lives under constant surveillance. Senators discovered that their bedroom activities were being reported directly to the Empress. Even high-ranking officials learned that their careers could be destroyed by a single night of indiscretion or enhanced by their willingness to participate in Theodora's private entertainments. This system allowed Theodora to exercise control that went far beyond traditional political power. She wasn't just ruling an empire, she was controlling the most intimate aspects of her subjects' lives, using their desires and fears as tools of governance. One of the Theodora's most controversial projects was the establishment of a monastery called Metanoia, repentance, designed to house former prostitutes and actresses who wanted to leave their previous lives behind. On the surface, this seemed like a genuinely charitable project, evidence of the Empress's commitment to moral reform, but the reality was far more complex and disturbing. Women who entered Metanoia found themselves subjected to rituals and practices that combined religious penance with psychological manipulation. They were required to confess not just their sins, but every detail of their previous experiences, creating a vast archive of sexual practices and preferences that Theodora used for her own purposes. Some historians suggest that Metanoia functioned less as a genuine monastery and more as a training ground where Theodora could identify women who might be suitable for her private entertainments. The line between salvation and exploitation became so blurred that it effectively disappeared. In 541 AD, the Justinian plague struck Constantinople with devastating force. As bodies piled up in the streets and the population fled in terror, many saw the disaster as divine punishment for the moral corruption of the imperial court. Theodora's response revealed the true depth of her psychological complexity. Rather than seeing plague as a call to repentance, she interpreted it as validation of her worldview, proof that only those with her unique understanding of human nature could navigate the chaos of existence. She used a crisis to consolidate power, eliminating political opponents who had succumbed to disease, while positioning herself as the strong leader who could guide the empire through its darkest hour. The plague became not a judgment on her reign, but a tool for extending it. By the 540s, Theodora had created a system of governance that was unlike anything the Byzantine Empire had overseen. Power flowed not through traditional channels of military command or bureaucratic hierarchy, but through a complex web of personal relationships based on shared secrets and mutual compromise. Senators who wanted imperial favor knew they had to participate in Theodora's private entertainments. Generals who sought promotions understood that their military success mattered less than their willingness to provide the Empress with information about their soldiers' private lives. This wasn't just corruption, it was the systematic transformation of an entire empire into an extension of Theodora's personal psychology, where the boundaries between public duty and private indulgence ceased to exist. Perhaps the darkest aspect of Theodora's reign involves the fate of children born to women in her network of reformed actresses and courtesans. Historical sources suggest that these children often vanished from official records. Some historians argue that Theodora was protecting these children from the stigma of their mothers' pasts, providing them with new identities and opportunities for advancement. Others suggest something far more sinister, that children were being removed to prevent potential blackmail or political complications. The truth may be even more disturbing than either explanation suggests. Evidence hints that some of these children were being groomed from birth to serve specific roles in Theodora's system, their entire lives planned and controlled to serve the Empress's long-term political goals. Throughout all of this, Justinian remained either genuinely oblivious to his wife's activities or willfully blind to them. He continued to see Theodora as his beloved partner and co-ruler, even as evidence mounted that she was operating a shadow government based on principles that contradicted everything he claimed to believe. Was this love, stupidity, or something more calculating? Some historians suggest that Justinian knew exactly what Theodora was doing and approved of it, seeing her methods as necessary tools for maintaining imperial power. Others argue that he was so psychologically dependent on her that he couldn't face the reality of what she had become. The relationship between these two rulers reveals something something profound about the nature of power and the human capacity for self-deception. How do we maintain our ideals when reality demands compromise? How do we love someone whose methods we cannot defend? Theodora died in 548 AD, probably from cancer, taking her secrets with her to the grave. Her death marked the end of one of the most controversial reigns in Byzantine history, and the beginning of a historical debate that continues to this day.
Was she a reformed woman who used her past to better understand human nature and serve her empire? Was she a power-hungry manipulator who corrupted an entire civilization to serve her personal ambitions?
Or was she something more complex, a product of her circumstances, who found ways to transform her suffering into strength, her degradation into dominance? The historical sources give us conflicting answers, partly because many of the most damning accounts come from enemies who had their own reasons for portraying her in the worst possible light. But even allowing for bias and exaggeration, the picture that emerges is of a woman whose life challenges our understanding of morality, power, and human nature itself. Theodora's influence on Byzantine culture extended far beyond her death. The legal reforms she championed genuinely improved the lives of women throughout the empire. The churches she funded became centers of learning and culture. The precedent she set for powerful empresses influenced politics for generations. But her darker legacy lived on as well. The culture of surveillance and sexual manipulation she created became embedded in Byzantine court life. Future rulers would use her methods, even if they lacked her intelligence and political skill. Perhaps most significantly, Theodora proved that the most profound transformations in history often come from the most unlikely sources. A woman who began her adult life as an object of public degradation ended it as one of the most powerful rulers in the world, reshaping law, religion, and culture according to her own vision.
Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, the possibility of redemption, and the complex relationship between personal morality and public achievement. In the end, Theodora remains what she was in life, a contradiction too complex for simple judgment, a woman whose story challenges every assumption we might make about virtue, vice, and the human capacity for transformation.
The Empress, who shocked an empire, left behind a legacy that continues to shock us today, not because of what she did, but because of what her success says about the world she lived in, and perhaps about the world we live in now.